Hello there, I'm Don Arleth and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. The leaders of over 30 countries as well as the EU and NATO chiefs gathered in Paris on Thursday for the third meeting of the Coalition of the Willing that will support Ukraine. French President Emannuel Macron announced the creation of a reassurance force that would be sent to Ukraine to discourage any further Russian aggression in the event that a ceasefire or peace deal is reached. And now joining me to discuss the details of the summit is Garvan Walshe, CEO of Article 7 Intelligence for Democrats. Mr. Walshe is also a former national and international security policy advisor to the British Conservative Party. Mr. Walshe, thank you very much for joining us here on World Talks.
Thank you and good evening.
Yes. Now, looking back here yesterday, how are the European leaders responding to the idea of deploying this reassurance force in Ukraine? Are there any notable divisions amongst EU countries? And really, I guess, who are the ones that are willing to volunteer their armies?
I mean, the thing about this reassurance force is I think it's looking increasingly like a device to keep stringing the negotiations on for the sake of the Americans. A tripwire force that would be sent to Ukraine isn't really a realistic deterrent to Russia. Realistic deterrence to Russia in the event of any peace deal would need to involve other things that would actually impose serious costs on Russia, and a reassurance force of the size of 10,000 troops or so that Macron has been talking about isn't that kind of force. To answer your question about divisions, Italy, for example, is not so keen on this reassurance force, whereas France and Britain have been pushing it. But I think we'd better see this as a part of the diplomatic negotiations with the United States rather than a direct concrete proposal. Direct concrete proposals for deterrence might involve things like Air Force assistance to Ukraine that Keir Starmer has mulled, or in fact other deployments in other parts of the European theatre that would force Russia to divide its forces and concentrate its mind.
Now, countries like Poland or the Baltics, Poland has said it's reluctant to send any soldiers there. It wants to play some sort of role, I imagine, in the logistics sphere, being that Poland is where it is. But countries like that, like Poland, like the Baltics, should they be not participating in such a meeting, in such a force due to the historical context that they find themselves in?
First of all, I think we need to look at the strategic context now, which is that the confrontation, as Friedrich Merz said, for example, a couple of days ago, is not between Russia and Ukraine, but it's between Russia and Europe. So in deciding what our response should be, we need to look at the objective. And the objective here is to make sure that if there is a deal, that Russia sticks by it, because Russia has a history of violating any peace deal it negotiates with anyone. It can only be compelled to uphold those deals. So then the question must be, how do we credibly show that we would impose costs on Russia for violating that? And those costs could come in Ukraine, but they could also come elsewhere. And we need to keep that flexibility open. Given all that, it's quite sensible for Poland and the Baltic states to keep their forces where they are, where they can also show that Russia has to watch the rest of its front with NATO countries or with European countries. The historical concerns are, of course, valid, particularly in the Polish case. The history between the two countries hasn't been exactly uncomplicated from the 1930s and in the 1940s and even afterwards. So they're wise to be reluctant for that reason, but it's also a strategic question. It may not be sensible for Poland to take troops away from its own front. If it is to deploy troops, they might be more usefully put in the Baltic states, for example. And then if there's going to be assistance deployed to Ukraine, it might actually make more sense for that to be air power, to show the Russians that their air forces could come under attack, to show that their supply lines to the Donbass could come into attack in the event that there is a ceasefire that freezes the conflict.
You mentioned costs to be imposed on Russia should it violate any potential ceasefire or peace agreement. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Where do you think that the European Union, NATO, holds the cards, and in which areas can they put high costs on Russia?
Yeah, I mean, let's put it first of all in the strictly military realm. Russia now has to defend against a front that stretches right from the north of Finland all the way down to the Donbass in Ukraine. That's an incredibly long border. And if it's not obvious that the only place that costs could be imposed on Russia would be in Ukraine. There are other areas further north that are quite close to St. Petersburg that are Russian territory that are also could be vulnerable to a response in the event of Russia violating the agreement. Then in Ukraine itself, Russia relies on supplying the Donbass and supplying Crimea, and an aerial response could interdict those supply lines and make things more difficult. In the political realm, there are other things that could be done. Obviously, the Trump administration complicates a lot, but sanctions are still rather porous. The European Union could impose secondary sanctions on companies that are found to do business with Russia, force them to choose between the Russian market and the European market. And the European market is going to be much larger for almost all of those companies. There are other measures that can be taken in the event of a breakdown in a ceasefire. But really, once you're in the talking about a reassurance force, or even in the Article 5 guarantee that Giorgia Meloni was talking about, she suggested that Ukraine should be brought into the NATO's Article 5 guarantee, though not necessarily within NATO. Even that, really, what we're saying is that if you violate this agreement, that means war with us. That's and then the question is how to make that threat credible. What are the deployments and the signaling that needs to be done to make Russia think that's a serious threat and not a paper tiger?
Looking at the current approach by the U.S. administration, I mean, we're obviously very far away from a ceasefire and especially a peace deal, but it's been very chaotic since the very beginning. I'm wondering if there isn't a role that maybe potentially that China could play here in this process, as the United States alienates its friends and partners here in Europe. Do you see any potential role for China? Any constructive role that China could play?
I don't think there's that much, because China is simply very far away from this. Obviously, China has certain interests in relation to Russia, certain in relation to Ukraine, and the EU and China can develop a pragmatic relationship where mutual interests exist. But I think the idea of trying to sort of split China off its no limits partnership with Russia in some way, I think is a little bit far-fetched. I think China will continue to pursue its interests. Obviously, there's the question of East Asia and American deployments there and Chinese designs in Taiwan. And it's would still not make a lot of sense for Europe to throw its eggs into the Chinese basket there. We have other important allies in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan itself that we wouldn't want to alienate.
Certainly. Now, for how much longer do you think the EU will be able to support Ukraine, both financially, militarily? Is the burden of Ukraine squarely fallen on the shoulders of Europe at this point in time? It certainly appears that way, especially when looking at the U.S. administration and the points that they are trumpeting, if you will, for the last few weeks.
I mean, help from the United States over the past few years was about $50 billion a year. That's actually not a very large amount of money for an economy the size of Europe's that's has a GDP of 17 trillion, or if you include the UK, you're talking about $20 trillion. It's something that we could do. It's something that we could do indefinitely if we needed to do. The question is how we ramp up our production to ensure that we can supply what Ukraine needs. We've made significant strides in supporting them with artillery ammunition. We're not the whole way there yet, but we are making progress. We now need to close the gap when it comes to air defense missiles, that are mostly supplied by the United States or supplied with U.S. systems. Then there's the question of satellite intelligence. Eutelsat, for example, has already said that it can replace Starlink in Ukraine, or at least most of its functionality. This isn't something that Europe cannot do. In many ways, when the United States says, in a kind of macro level, look, Europe, you're a rich continent, you should take care of your own security, they've got a point. The problem is the way they're doing it and the reasons they're doing it for, rather than the overall aim that Europe should be able to defend itself. We're rich enough, we have advanced technology. Russia is a significantly smaller country than Europe as a whole, and we should be able to manage this.
Well, right, and there's been calls for somewhat of a phased-in approach so that the United States slowly continues to provide the umbrella for Europe, if you will, but does so over a 10-year period of time to where Europe can rearm the continent and take the lead of its own security. Do you think that this is the way it should properly be handled instead of this knee-jerk approach, what we're seeing coming out of Washington?
I think that's the kind of thing we should have negotiated with the Biden administration, not with the Trump administration. The trouble is this administration is unpredictable, unreliable, and there's no guarantee it would stick to any 10 years phase plan. We need to close the key gaps as quickly as possible. And a 10-year plan would be nice, but I don't think we've the luxury of that kind of time. We have particular shortcomings in our ability to suppress enemy air defense. We have certain intelligence and communication shortcomings that have to be met. We have certain production capacity shortcomings that also have to be met. It's not so much a question of the overall number of platforms, the tanks, the planes, the artillery pieces. It's more a question of the ammunition, the missiles, and the communications technology that are needed to support those platforms. And then we also need to learn from what Ukraine has been able to do. It's now able to use drones so effectively that they can hold the line with far fewer troops than was thought possible before. This will be essential in any European defense, because one of the things that does take a long time is actually to train soldiers to be able to operate in a modern war environment, and our armies are going to have to expand, but it's going to be one of the more time-consuming things that can be done. To train soldiers, you have to take other soldiers who know what they're doing, and you have to take them off other duties and put them on training duties. So there's a pipeline of expansion that has to be done, and you can only ramp up relatively slowly. But this kind of technology is going to help us, particularly because we are an advanced continent. We're able to deploy technology well. It would be very good if European armies can actually go to Ukraine, not to train them, but to learn from Ukrainian forces, to be embedded in their warfighting operation and understand how they're currently fighting this very intense drone-enabled war that is completely new and that non-Ukrainian European armies don't have experience of fighting.
I believe it was Macron that said a Franco-British military delegation will soon head to Ukraine to consider how its army could take shape in the long term. Is this maybe potentially what you're talking about? What do you think that they're going to learn that they don't already know after 3 years of full-scale war with Russia?
Well, maybe more that they need to teach us some things, and that we can learn from them. They've been the ones fighting Russia, and we should be able to learn from them. Now, there are things we can still teach them, particularly around around military leadership and around this thing that's known as mission command, which is that Western armies tend to believe that the way to fight is by trusting your officers to execute missions in general. The Soviet tradition was to give everyone very detailed instructions, and the Ukrainian military is in a transition from the Soviet to the Western mode of command. So there's probably more things we can help them with there. We can help them coordinate large-scale offensives at the division or corps level, and also we could probably help them significantly more in the air domain, because so far Ukraine has been fighting without a major air force. They've been fighting defensively against the Russian air force. They've been able to neutralize it, but they don't fight in the same way that we do. Our military doctrine assumes that we use air power a lot. We aim to achieve air superiority before bringing in our land forces. And that's something Ukraine hasn't been able to do yet, and it's something that we could help them with, as well as helping them with equipment.
Okay, Garvan Walshe, CEO at Article 7 Intelligence for Democrats. Thank you very much for joining me today. Appreciate your analysis.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.